Here are 30 most commonly asked scenario-based interview question and answers for Cybersecurity Incident Response Manager role. These 30 scenario-based interview questions and answers are crafted to prepare cybersecurity incident response managers for complex, real-world challenges, captivating you people with cutting-edge insights into cloud security incidents. Each question addresses critical scenarios across AWS, Azure, GCP, and hybrid environments, reflecting the dynamic responsibilities of incident response leadership. Some curveball questions, clearly marked, simulate high-pressure situations, showcasing strategic thinking and crisis management skills that will wow you people with their intensity. These answers cover ransomware, APTs, compliance, and emerging threats like cryptojacking. This content is designed to intrigue professionals and demonstrate advanced expertise. Question 1. Scenario: your organization detects a ransomware attack affecting critical systems in a hybrid cloud environment. How would you lead the incident response process to contain and recover from this attack? Answer: to lead the incident response process for a ransomware attack in a hybrid cloud environment, I would initiate a structured response aligned with the NIST Incident Response Framework. I would immediately convene the incident response team, including IT, security, legal, and communication stakeholders, to assess the scope. I would isolate affected systems by segmenting networks in on-premises and cloud environments, using tools like AWS Network Firewall or Azure Firewalls to prevent lateral movement. I would analyze logs with a SIM tool, such as Splunk, to identify the attack vector and impacted assets. For recovery, I would restore systems from immutable backups stored in air-gapped cloud storage, ensuring no residual malware remains. I would coordinate with legal teams to evaluate ransom demands and compliance requirements, such as GDPR notifications. Post-recovery, I would conduct a root cause analysis, update security policies, and implement additional controls like endpoint detection and response, EDR, to prevent recurrence. This comprehensive approach ensures rapid containment and recovery. Question 2. Scenario: a phishing campaign compromises employee credentials, leading to unauthorized access in your AWS environment. How would you respond and mitigate this incident? To address a phishing campaign compromising employee credentials in AWS, I would follow a structured incident response process. This ensures rapid containment and mitigation to secure the environment. A. I would revoke compromised credentials using AWS IAM and enforce multi-factor authentication, MFA, for all accounts to prevent further unauthorized access. B. I would analyze CloudTrail logs and guard duty findings to trace the attacker's actions and identify accessed resources. C. I would reset passwords for affected accounts and apply IAM policies to restrict access to sensitive resources. D. I would implement mandatory phishing awareness training and deploy email security gateways to filter malicious emails. E. I would set up real-time alerts in Security Hub to detect similar credential misuse, ensuring ongoing protection. Question 3. Scenario: during a routine audit, you discover a misconfigured firewall in Azure allowing public access to a critical database. How would you handle this to prevent a potential breach? Answer: to address a misconfigured firewall in Azure allowing public access to a critical database, I would prioritize immediate containment and long-term prevention. I would first update the Azure Network Security Group, NSG, rules to restrict access to authorized IP ranges only, ensuring the database is no longer publicly accessible. I would then use Azure Monitor and activity logs to investigate any unauthorized access attempts prior to the fix. I would collaborate with the Cloud Operations team to identify how the misconfiguration occurred, reviewing infrastructure as code, IAC, templates or manual changes. To prevent recurrence, I would implement Azure policy to enforce compliant firewall configurations and schedule regular automated scans with Microsoft Defender for Cloud. I would also document the incident and train the team on secure configuration practices. This proactive response ensures compliance and security. Question 4. Scenario: your organization experiences a DDoS attack targeting its cloud-hosted web application. How would you lead the response to mitigate the attack and restore services? To lead the response to a DDoS attack on a cloud-hosted web application, I would implement a layered defense strategy. This ensures rapid mitigation and service restoration under pressure. A. I would use AWS Shield or Azure DDoS protection to detect the attack and analyze traffic patterns with CloudWatch or Application Insights. B. I would activate Web Application Firewall, WAF, rules to block malicious traffic and scale application resources with auto-scaling to handle increased load. C. I would notify stakeholders via a predefined incident communication plan, providing regular updates on mitigation progress. D. I would reroute traffic using Route 53 or Azure Traffic Manager to healthy endpoints, ensuring service availability. E. I would conduct a lessons learned session to update DDoS mitigation strategies and enhance resilience. Question 5. Scenario: a critical application in GCP is compromised due to an exploited API vulnerability. How would you lead the investigation and remediation efforts? Answer: to lead the response to a compromised GCP application due to an API vulnerability, I would follow a structured incident response process. I would first isolate the affected API by disabling public access through Google Cloud's API Gateway or VPC service controls. I would analyze cloud audit logs and Security Command Center findings to trace the exploit's entry point and scope of impact. I would collaborate with developers to patch the vulnerability, ensuring secure coding practices are applied. To remediate, I would revoke compromised API keys and implement stricter authentication, such as OAuth 2.0. I would deploy web application firewall rules to filter malicious requests and conduct penetration testing to validate the fix. Post-incident, I would update the incident response plan and implement continuous API monitoring with tools like Apigee, ensuring robust protection. Question 6. Curveball question. Scenario: during a high-profile product launch, your cloud environment is targeted by a sophisticated APT group, and you suspect data exfiltration. How would you respond under intense scrutiny? To counter an APT group targeting the cloud environment during a product launch, I would act swiftly under scrutiny. This ensures containment and maintains stakeholder confidence in a high-stakes scenario. A. I would isolate affected systems using network segmentation in AWS VPCs or Azure VNETs to limit data exfiltration. B. I would engage a third-party forensic team and use cloud-native tools like AWS Detective to trace attacker activity. C. I would provide transparent updates to executives and PR teams, balancing technical accuracy with public-facing messaging. D. I would deploy EDR tools and update IAM policies to prevent further unauthorized access. E. I would integrate threat intelligence feeds to enhance detection, ensuring robust defense. Question 7. Scenario: a third-party vendor's compromised credentials lead to unauthorized access in your Azure environment. How would you handle this incident? Answer: to address unauthorized access due to a third-party vendor's compromised credentials in Azure, I would initiate a rapid response to contain and mitigate the breach. I would revoke the compromised credentials using Azure AD and enforce MFA for all vendor accounts. I would analyze activity logs and Microsoft Defender for cloud alerts to identify accessed resources and the attack scope. I would work with the vendor to verify their system security and require them to update their credentials. To prevent recurrence, I would implement conditional access policies to restrict vendor access to specific resources and enable just-in-time access. I would also conduct a security review of all third-party integrations and update the vendor management policy. Question 8. Scenario: you need to ensure GDPR compliance during a cloud security incident involving personal data. How would you manage this? To ensure GDPR compliance during a cloud security incident, I would align response actions with regulatory requirements. This ensures legal adherence and protects personal data effectively. A. I would use Cloud DLP in GCP or AWS Macie to classify affected personal data and confirm GDPR applicability. B. I would notify the data protection officer and regulatory authorities within 72 hours, as required by GDPR. C. I would isolate affected systems and encrypt data in transit and at rest to prevent further exposure. D. I would maintain detailed logs of the incident response process for audit purposes. E. I would implement data anonymization and stricter access controls to ensure ongoing compliance. Question 9. Scenario: your organization's Kubernetes cluster in AWS EKS is compromised due to a misconfigured RBAC policy. How would you respond and secure the environment? Answer: to respond to a compromised Kubernetes cluster in AWS EKS due to a misconfigured RBAC policy, I would initiate a comprehensive incident response. I would first isolate the cluster by restricting network access using security groups and network policies. I would analyze EKS control plane logs and CloudTrail to identify unauthorized actions and the misconfiguration source. I would update RBAC policies to enforce least privilege, removing excessive permissions. I would deploy vulnerability scanning with tools like Trivy to ensure no residual threats remain. To secure the environment, I would integrate AWS Secrets Manager for sensitive data and enable runtime monitoring with Falco. I would also conduct team training on secure Kubernetes configurations. Question 10. Scenario: a critical application experiences a data breach due to an SQL injection vulnerability. How would you lead the response and prevent future attacks? To address a data breach caused by an SQL injection vulnerability, I would lead a structured response to contain and remediate the issue. This ensures rapid recovery and strengthens future defenses. A. I would take the application offline temporarily and apply WAF rules to block malicious requests. B. I would analyze application logs and database audit trails to determine the breach's scope and affected data. C. I would work with developers to sanitize inputs and patch the vulnerability. D. I would implement parameterized queries and regular code reviews in the CI/CD pipeline. E. I would deploy a SIM tool to detect future SQL injection attempts, ensuring robust protection.
Please check description or comments section of this video. I have given a lot of links for downloading 6 PDFs containing all types of most asked interview question and answers like scenario-based, technical-based, behavioral-based, real-world problem-solving, generally most asked, and system design. Required for your cybersecurity jobs interviews like Junior Cybersecurity Analyst jobs, Cybersecurity Analyst jobs, Cybersecurity SOC Analyst jobs, Cybersecurity GRC jobs, Cybersecurity CISO jobs, Cybersecurity Incident Responder jobs, Cybersecurity Vulnerability Analyst jobs, Cybersecurity Malware Analyst jobs, Cybersecurity Engineer jobs, Cybersecurity Architect jobs, Cybersecurity Manager jobs, Cybersecurity Consultant jobs, Cybersecurity Specialist jobs, etc., etc. These questions and answers are carefully curated by industry experts, saving you people hours of research and ensuring you people will have the most accurate and relevant answers. This PDFs includes scenario-based questions and answers, real-world problem solving, interview questions and answers where almost 80% of the people are failing to answer, system design questions and answers where almost 90% of the people are failing to answer, with detailed solutions, which are often missing from free online resources. A lot of people are claiming that these questions are coming in real interviews. So, grab them as soon as possible with both hands. Since these questions and answers covers basic to advanced interview questions and answers, that's why given 50 question and answers for each section, these questions and answers will be helpful for freshers, 2 to 3 years experienced people, and 5 or above years experienced people also for your interviews. You people can download all 6 PDFs in a single zip file from below given links.
Question 11. Curveball question. Scenario: during a board meeting, a critical cloud service is hit by a zero-day exploit, and no patch is available. How would you manage the response under executive pressure? Answer: to manage a zero-day exploit affecting a critical cloud service during a board meeting, I would focus on containment and clear communication under pressure. I would isolate the affected service using network segmentation, such as AWS VPC or Azure VNet, to prevent further exploitation. I would analyze logs with AWS GuardDuty or Azure Sentinel to assess the exploit's impact and identify compromised assets. I would implement compensating controls, such as WAF rules or temporary access restrictions, to mitigate risk. I would communicate transparently with executives, providing a clear action plan and expected resolution timeline. I would collaborate with the cloud provider for early mitigation guidance and deploy deception techniques like honeypots to monitor attacker activity. Post-incident, I would update the incident response plan and enhance threat intelligence integration. Question 12. Scenario: your organization detects a supply chain attack affecting a third-party software component in your cloud infrastructure. How would you respond? To respond to a supply chain attack affecting a third-party software component, I would act swiftly to contain and mitigate the threat. This ensures minimal impact and strengthens supply chain security. A. I would isolate affected components using container orchestration tools like Kubernetes network policies. B. I would use cloud-native forensics tools like AWS Detective to trace the attack's origin and impact. C. I would replace compromised components with verified versions and update dependency management processes. D. I would implement software bill of materials, SBOM, and regular vulnerability scanning. E. I would notify stakeholders and third-party vendors to coordinate mitigation efforts. Question 13. Scenario: a distributed denial of service, DDoS, attack overwhelms your cloud-hosted API gateway. How would you lead the response to restore services? Answer: to lead the response to a DDoS attack overwhelming a cloud-hosted API gateway, I would implement a layered defense strategy to restore services quickly. I would activate AWS Shield Advanced or Azure DDoS protection to detect and mitigate the attack, analyzing traffic patterns with CloudWatch or Application Insights. I would deploy Web Application Firewall, WAF, rules to block malicious traffic and configure auto-scaling to handle increased load. I would reroute traffic to healthy endpoints using Route 53 or Azure Traffic Manager to ensure service availability. I would communicate with stakeholders through a predefined incident response plan, providing regular updates on mitigation progress. Post-incident, I would conduct a root cause analysis, update DDoS protection strategies, and simulate attacks to test resilience. Question 14. Scenario: you detect an insider threat accessing sensitive data in your GCP environment. How would you investigate and mitigate this? To investigate and mitigate an insider threat in GCP, I would follow a structured incident response process. This ensures thorough investigation and robust mitigation to protect sensitive data. A. I would enable cloud audit logs and analyze patterns with BigQuery to identify anomalous access. B. I would correlate logs with IAM activity to pinpoint the insider's account and actions. C. I would revoke access temporarily and implement just-in-time access with Privileged Access Manager. D. I would enhance monitoring with Security Command Center for real-time alerts. E. I would conduct a root cause analysis and update access policies to prevent recurrence. Question 15. Scenario: a critical application in your AWS environment is compromised due to a stolen API key. How would you lead the response to secure the environment? Answer: to lead the response to a compromised AWS application due to a stolen API key, I would initiate a rapid incident response to secure the environment. I would immediately revoke the stolen API key using AWS IAM and rotate all related credentials. I would analyze CloudTrail logs and GuardDuty findings to trace the unauthorized access and assess impacted resources. I would implement stricter API key management using AWS Secrets Manager with automatic rotation policies. I would collaborate with developers to audit application code for secure API usage and deploy WAF rules to block suspicious requests. Post-incident, I would conduct a security review of all API integrations and train the team on secure key handling. Question 16. Scenario: your organization needs to respond to a cloud security incident while maintaining HIPAA compliance. How would you manage this? To manage a cloud security incident while maintaining HIPAA compliance, I would align response with regulatory standards. This ensures protection of sensitive health data and compliance. A. I would isolate affected systems using network controls to prevent further data exposure. B. I would use AWS Macie or Azure Information Protection to classify and assess compromised PHI. C. I would notify the HIPAA compliance officer and relevant authorities per regulatory requirements. D. I would implement encryption and access controls for PHI to ensure ongoing protection. E. I would maintain detailed incident logs and conduct compliance audits. Question 17. Scenario: a malware outbreak affects multiple VMs in your Azure environment. How would you lead the response to contain and eradicate the malware? Answer: to lead the response to a malware outbreak affecting Azure VMs, I would follow a structured incident response process to contain and eradicate the threat. I would isolate infected VMs by placing them in a quarantine VNet and disabling network access. I would use Microsoft Defender for Cloud to analyze malware signatures and identify the infection source. I would deploy clean VM images from backups to restore services and ensure no residual malware remains. I would collaborate with the security team to patch vulnerabilities and update endpoint protection with tools like CrowdStrike. I would also enhance monitoring with Azure Sentinel to detect future outbreaks. Post-incident, I would conduct a lessons learned session and update the incident response plan. Question 18. Scenario: you need to respond to a data breach involving sensitive customer data in a multi-cloud environment. How would you coordinate the response? To coordinate a data breach response in a multi-cloud environment, I would ensure a unified and rapid response. This addresses the breach across AWS, Azure, and GCP effectively. A. I would convene a cross-functional incident response team to assess the breach's scope. B. I would isolate affected resources using cloud-native network controls like VPCs or VNETs. C. I would analyze logs with a SIM tool like Splunk to identify the breach's origin and impact. D. I would notify legal and compliance teams to meet regulatory reporting requirements. E. I would implement automated scans and patches to prevent recurrence across clouds. Question 19. Scenario: your organization's cloud infrastructure is targeted by a brute force attack on administrative accounts. How would you respond to mitigate this? Answer: to respond to a brute force attack on administrative accounts in the cloud, I would implement immediate containment and long-term prevention measures. I would lock affected accounts using AWS IAM or Azure AD and enforce MFA across all admin accounts. I would analyze CloudTrail or activity logs to identify the attack source and scope, blocking malicious IPS with WAF rules. I would implement rate-limiting policies on authentication endpoints to prevent future brute force attempts. I would also deploy account lockout mechanisms after failed login attempts and monitor with GuardDuty or Sentinel for suspicious activity. Post-incident, I would train admins on strong password policies and update the incident response plan. Question 20. Scenario: a misconfigured serverless function in AWS Lambda exposes sensitive data. How would you respond to this incident? To address a misconfigured AWS Lambda function exposing sensitive data, I would act quickly to contain and remediate the issue. This ensures data protection and prevents further exposure. A. I would update the Lambda function's IAM role to enforce least privilege access. B. I would analyze CloudTrail logs to identify unauthorized data access. C. I would enable encryption for sensitive data using AWS KMS. I would scan Lambda code with CodeGuru to detect misconfigurations. E. I would implement automated configuration checks to prevent future issues.
Please check description or comments section of this video. I have given a lot of links for downloading 6 PDFs containing all types of most asked interview question and answers like scenario-based, technical-based, behavioral-based, real-world problem-solving, generally most asked, and system design. Required for your cybersecurity jobs interviews like Junior Cybersecurity Analyst jobs, Cybersecurity Analyst jobs, Cybersecurity SOC Analyst jobs, Cybersecurity GRC jobs, Cybersecurity CISO jobs, Cybersecurity Incident Responder jobs, Cybersecurity Vulnerability Analyst jobs, Cybersecurity Malware Analyst jobs, Cybersecurity Engineer jobs, Cybersecurity Architect jobs, Cybersecurity Manager jobs, Cybersecurity Consultant jobs, Cybersecurity Specialist jobs, etc., etc. These questions and answers are carefully curated by industry experts, saving you people hours of research and ensuring you people will have the most accurate and relevant answers. This PDFs includes scenario-based questions and answers, real-world problem solving, interview questions and answers where almost 80% of the people are failing to answer, system design questions and answers where almost 90% of the people are failing to answer, with detailed solutions, which are often missing from free online resources. A lot of people are claiming that these questions are coming in real interviews. So, grab them as soon as possible with both hands. Since these questions and answers covers basic to advanced interview questions and answers, that's why given 50 question and answers for each section, these questions and answers will be helpful for freshers, 2 to 3 years experienced people, and 5 or above years experienced people also for your interviews. You people can download all 6 PDFs in a single zip file from below given links.
Question 21. Curveball question. Scenario: during a live customer demo, a critical cloud service is compromised by a supply chain attack, and the attacker demands a ransom. How would you respond under public scrutiny? Answer: to respond to a supply chain attack compromising a cloud service during a live customer demo, I would act decisively under public scrutiny to maintain trust. I would isolate the compromised service using network segmentation, such as AWS VPC or Azure VNet, to prevent further damage. I would analyze logs with AWS Detective or Azure Sentinel to trace the attack's origin and scope. I would communicate transparently with customers and stakeholders, providing a clear action plan without disclosing sensitive details. I would collaborate with legal teams to assess the ransom demand, prioritizing data recovery from immutable backups. I would deploy EDR tools and update third-party software vetting processes to prevent recurrence. Post-incident, I would enhance supply chain security with SBOM practices. Question 22. Scenario: you detect a privilege escalation attack in your GCP environment. How would you investigate and mitigate this? To investigate and mitigate a privilege escalation attack in GCP, I would follow a structured response process. This ensures containment and prevents further unauthorized access. A. I would analyze cloud audit logs and IAM recommender to identify unauthorized privilege changes. B. I would revoke elevated permissions and enforce least privilege IAM policies. C. I would deploy Security Command Center to detect similar attack patterns. D. I would conduct a forensic analysis to identify the attack vector, such as a misconfigured service account. E. I would implement automated IAM audits to prevent future escalations. Question 23. Scenario: a social engineering attack compromises an executive's cloud account, leading to data exposure. How would you lead the response? Answer: to lead the response to a social engineering attack compromising an executive's cloud account, I would prioritize containment and communication. I would immediately disable the compromised account using Azure AD or AWS IAM and enforce MFA for all executive accounts. I would analyze activity logs or CloudTrail to trace unauthorized actions and assess data exposure. I would collaborate with the executive to verify their device security and reset credentials. I would deploy EDR tools like CrowdStrike to monitor for residual threats and implement conditional access policies to restrict sensitive access. I would also conduct phishing awareness training for executives and update the incident response plan. Question 24. Scenario: your organization needs to respond to a cloud security incident while maintaining HIPAA compliance. How would you manage this? To manage a cloud security incident while maintaining HIPAA compliance, I would align response with regulatory standards. This ensures protection of sensitive health data and compliance. A. I would isolate affected systems using network controls to prevent further data exposure. B. I would use AWS Macie or Azure Information Protection to classify and assess compromised PHI. C. I would notify the HIPAA compliance officer and relevant authorities per regulatory requirements. D. I would implement encryption and access controls for PHI to ensure ongoing protection. E. I would maintain detailed incident logs and conduct compliance audits. Question 25. Scenario: a cloud-based application is targeted by a botnet attack generating malicious API requests. How would you lead the response? Answer: to lead the response to a botnet attack generating malicious API requests on a cloud-based application, I would implement a rapid mitigation strategy. I would deploy WAF rules in AWS API Gateway or Azure API Management to filter malicious traffic based on patterns like high request rates. I would analyze logs with CloudWatch or Application Insights to identify the botnet's source and behavior. I would implement rate limiting and CAPTCHA challenges to block automated requests. I would scale the application using auto-scaling to maintain availability during the attack. I would communicate with stakeholders to provide updates and manage expectations. Post-incident, I would enhance API security with token-based authentication and conduct penetration testing. Question 26. Curveball question. Scenario: during a regulatory audit, you discover an ongoing data breach, but the attacker's identity is unknown, and regulators demand immediate action. How would you respond? To respond to an ongoing data breach during a regulatory audit with an unknown attacker, I would act decisively under pressure. This ensures compliance and containment while addressing regulatory demands. A. I would isolate affected systems using network segmentation to stop data exfiltration. B. I would analyze logs with a SIM tool like Splunk to trace the breach's scope and entry point. C. I would notify regulators and stakeholders, providing transparent updates per compliance timelines. D. I would deploy forensic tools and engage experts to identify the attacker's tactics. E. I would update security controls and incident response plans to prevent recurrence. Question 27. Scenario: a cloud storage bucket is inadvertently exposed, risking sensitive data leakage. How would you lead the response to secure the environment? Answer: to lead the response to an inadvertently exposed cloud storage bucket, I would prioritize containment and prevention to secure the environment. I would immediately set the bucket to private using AWS S3 block public access or Azure Blob storage access controls. I would analyze access logs with AWS Athena or Azure Monitor to identify any unauthorized access. I would collaborate with the cloud team to investigate the misconfigurations cause, such as incorrect IAM policies. I would implement automated scans with AWS Macie or Azure Defender to detect similar exposures. I would also train the team on secure bucket configurations and update the incident response plan. Question 28. Scenario: you need to respond to a security incident involving a compromised container in a Kubernetes cluster. How would you manage this? To manage a security incident involving a compromised Kubernetes container, I would follow a structured response process. This ensures containment and secures the cluster effectively. A. I would isolate the compromised container by deleting the pod and restricting network access. B. I would analyze logs with Kubernetes audit logs and Falco to identify the compromise's source. C. I would scan container images with Trivy to detect vulnerabilities. D. I would update RBAC policies to enforce least privilege access. E. I would implement runtime monitoring to prevent future compromises. Question 29. Scenario: your organization's cloud environment is targeted by a cryptojacking attack. How would you lead the response to mitigate this? Answer: to lead the response to a cryptojacking attack targeting the cloud environment, I would focus on rapid detection and mitigation. I would use AWS GuardDuty or Azure Sentinel to detect unauthorized compute resource usage indicative of cryptojacking. I would isolate affected instances by terminating or quarantining them to stop malicious processes. I would analyze logs to identify the attack vector, such as a compromised application or misconfigured access. I would patch vulnerabilities and implement stricter IAM policies to prevent unauthorized resource access. I would deploy monitoring for CPU and network anomalies to detect future attacks. Post-incident, I would conduct a security review and train the team on recognizing cryptojacking signs. Question 30. Curveball question. Scenario: a nation-state actor targets your cloud infrastructure with a persistent threat, and you discover it during a routine audit. How would you respond under regulatory scrutiny? To respond to a nation-state actor's persistent threat discovered during an audit, I would orchestrate a strategic response under regulatory scrutiny. This ensures containment and compliance with minimal disruption. A. I would isolate affected systems using network segmentation to prevent further infiltration. B. I would engage a forensic team and use cloud-native tools like AWS Detective to trace attacker activity. C. I would notify regulators and stakeholders, providing transparent updates per compliance requirements. D. I would deploy deception techniques like honeypots to monitor attacker behavior. E. I would integrate threat intelligence feeds and update defenses to prevent recurrence.
Please check description or comment section of this video. I have given a lot of links for downloading 6 PDFs containing all types of most asked interview question and answers like scenario-based, technical-based, behavioral-based, real-world problem-solving, generally most asked, and system design. Required for your cybersecurity jobs interviews like Junior Cybersecurity Analyst jobs, Cybersecurity Analyst jobs, Cybersecurity SOC Analyst jobs, Cybersecurity GRC jobs, Cybersecurity CISO jobs, Cybersecurity Incident Responder jobs, Cybersecurity Vulnerability Analyst jobs, Cybersecurity Malware Analyst jobs, Cybersecurity Engineer jobs, Cybersecurity Architect jobs, Cybersecurity Manager jobs, Cybersecurity Consultant jobs, Cybersecurity Specialist jobs, etc., etc. These questions and answers are carefully curated by industry experts, saving you people hours of research and ensuring you people will have the most accurate and relevant answers. This PDFs includes scenario-based questions and answers, real-world problem solving. Interview questions and answers where almost 80% of the people are failing to answer, system design questions and answers where almost 90% of the people are failing to answer, with detailed solutions, which are often missing from free online resources. A lot of people are claiming that these questions are coming in real interviews. So, grab them as soon as possible with both hands. Since these questions and answers covers basic to advanced interview questions and answers, that's why given 50 question and answers for each section. These questions and answers will be helpful for freshers, 2 to 3 years experienced people, and 5 or above years experienced people also for your interviews. You people can download all 6 PDFs in a single zip file from below given links.
For more exciting tips, tricks, and more importantly, for valuable insights of interviews, please share, like, and subscribe to my channel. It has a lot of valuable information about various insights of interviews. It has a wide range of real-world portfolio projects of various technologies for interviews, and it has wide range of most asked interview questions and answers of various technologies like data science, SAP, AWS, DevOps, and full-stack web development, and more. That will be useful during interviews. It has a wide range of most asked interview questions and answers and real-world portfolio projects of various technologies for freshers, for 2 to 3 years, experienced candidates, and for 5 or above years, experienced candidates to test their skills by knowing most asked interview questions and make themselves ready for interviews.